All right. Hello, everyone. Stacy, can you do a quick check for me, see if you can screen share with us?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. All right. Then I will give us a brief introduction here.
It says that I need disabled participant screen sharing. Did you share with me? Am I shared as a co-host?
It's not giving me access. Nicole, do you see if you can give Stacy access?
And indeed, yes. Sorry, Stacy.
Okay, should I try it now? Or you tell me when I'm on?
You should be good.
Okay, up, that looks good. Okay, one.
You're doing great. I'm just killing it with technology today, guys. So thank you for being here, putting up with me, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you for everyone's patience there with that little technical difficulty. So thank you all for joining us today in this third and final installment of our series with Stacy Levy. I will give a brief biography for those of you who this might be the first event you've attended in the series. Stacy Levy is an artist who works with rain, urban tides, and watersheds. Her projects give a home to rain on many sites, from parking lots to nature centers. And we certainly know a lot about rain here this week in Akron. Her installations on tidal rivers give people a sense of the amplitude and timing of the tides in cities. She also works to make visible how watersheds are the capillaries of the land, carrying precious rainwater from sky to the sea. She's created temporary and permanent works in Philadelphia, New York, Seattle, Phoenix, Tampa, Miami, San Antonio, and Fayetteville, Arkansas. She often collaborates with engineers, ecologists, and landscape architects to make artwork that helps solve simple site issues like stormwater runoff, water pollution, and stream bank erosion. Stacy graduated with a BA from the Yale University, majoring in art and forestry, and got her MFA from the Tyler School of Art at Temple University, and then attended a year at the Architectural Association in London. And we are so incredibly pleased to have her here today to kind of talk more about her process as she evaluates a site and works with partners and a budget and all those other very important things that we're all very well aware of. So Stacy, I'll turn it over to you, and you just let us know how you'd like to handle questions and everything, because this is a little bit of a different format from our past events. So you let us know what works for you, and we're really excited to take part.
Great. We'll probably do a break somewhere in the middle to take some questions so that they don't have to wait so long. But everyone who's here, and thank you for being here today, make sure you keep a running list of questions you want to ask. If you don't want to put it in the chat, just put them on the paper for the time being, and then you could pop them in the chat. I guess that's how you're getting your question and answers. And sometimes I like just to keep them separate. It's to put an asterisk if it's a question, nothing if it's a statement. But it'd be great to make this a tad more informal when we get to a question and answer period and really have a back and forth, because I'm sure that many of you have lots of questions, and many will be developed over time. So we'll get started. So welcome to the brass tacks of public art. I have to say that I had to learn this pretty much the hard way, because people weren't doing public art at the time, or I didn't know who was doing it. And but it was a slow learn. I'm going to be talking a lot about sort of how I approach the site, and then there'll be a section where I'm talking about budgeting too. That's the real brass tacks that we'll talk about, and a little about prototyping will be in there too. So I hope I hit on things, and if I haven't hit on something you want to know about, write it down and ask me when we have a break for questions, which we'll do after sort of somewhere in the midway. I'm never sure how long things are going to take. So let's get started with this and make sure that my thing, yes, here we go. We go here. Okay, so I'm very interested in what we're searching for when we want to design with nature. For years, I made sort of replications of what nature looked like. And now I've shifted my work, and I want to be talking about a translation of nature, letting people understand it a little bit more, and often working with a natural system. But overall, all of my works are a kind of translations of the natural world. I want to show how the world is working around us. And I want to share that understanding of nature that I gain often through these projects. I don't always know everything about what I'm going to look at when I start a project. I have to do a lot of research to get caught up with how things are working on the site. But once I find out about something, I really want to share it with other people if it's interesting. And I think that's very true with most artists. Art is about feeling and understanding and then sharing it with others. And particularly with public art, which happens in this kind of everyday way. It's a gift that you stick out there in the world and you have no idea who's receiving it. Us public artists have to have a very strong sense of wanting to share because we're doing it without knowing what people are thinking. I'm very interested in simply the complexity of natural patterns and putting them in places you wouldn't expect. This is the Philadelphia airport, which we'll be looking at quite a bit more. So that you land in a new city and walk around waiting for your bags to be collected, and you can find something that really introduces you to the region in an evocative way, and not a hey, come eat our special cheddar cheese or whatever. It's more about introducing the waterways, which doesn't often get introduced. I often think about like what most people see who haven't been trained to look at how nature works. So we will, a beautiful vista like this is what we would see. And this is what a geologist sees, like how the whole thing is put together, all the layers, all the different types of rocks. And so in some ways, this is what I'm trying to do as an artist, is to get us to see like a geologist or an ecologist or a botanist or an entomologist, to see these invisible to us worlds. We just see green in a waterfall and we're not seeing the folded rock and the different formations over millennia. And I think that that's a really wonderful story to know. So a lot of this work is telling a story. And the story that I particularly love to tell about is the story of water. I really want to share that beauty and fascination and importance of water, but I don't want to do it as a fountain. I want to do it in a drier form because fountains are very, very expensive to make and very hard to maintain. As I always say, this year's fountain is next year's planter. But one of the things that I've always loved is the formation of water, how it forms itself over time. The meandering form of a river is something that all rivers do. At some point, they will start to meander. And so the how and the why of that's very interesting to me. And so I've done some pieces where I'm trying to capture that flow and that hydrology of a small commonplace urban stream, just trying to find a site. This is a museum site that it's in the middle of Toronto, but it's in a kind of wooded edge. And there's streams running out of that woodland. And I wanted to describe those streams, even though you can't see them, you're not going to get wet in this, and you're in an extremely urban setting. But I wanted to make that natural phenomenon happen in an urban setting so you can sort of understand a stream. And then with other things like looking at the tides, there, fishermen and people who boat, fisher people and boaters get to have an understanding of the tide, but the rest of us, it's kind of lost on us. So I'm interested in translating these processes. If I know something's happening in nature in that site that I'm working in, I really want to express the process to everyone else because of being curious and wanting to share. Two traits or disabilities, depending on how you see it, that is really important to have as a public artist. Those are traits that really are critical. That kind of curiosity you start with, and the idea of sharing what you've learned. So, and another take on translating tides. One was a temporary chalk piece. This is this was up for a year and floating in the river. And very difficult to work in water. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I'd be very open to talk more about it in the question and answer period. And I'm totally into the idea of locating these forgotten water ways that are in our neighborhoods. The stream that runs under our street, the stream that probably named the street. Half of our streets, it seems like, have the names of our forgotten waterways. They're named after the waters that they used to pass by or over. Sometimes they're completely built over. And I want to bring those back to life. Oh, well, we just had a freeze. Why? Okay, there, sorry. I'm hoping that my internet got more robust, but we'll see. So taking those kind of urban waterways and bringing them into a view in a completely different way, not always right where they are, as was in the Toronto piece, but sometimes in a gallery setting. So there are these things that I love to look at and that I want to share. And if you've flown, you've probably seen that glint that rivers do, this silver ribbon you get in the landscape when the sun hits it the right way. You have to be fairly high above it. It's a phenomenon that I guess people could have had on mountaintops, and sometimes I've had on high ridges, but the airplane is really perfect for looking down at these amazing meanders. And when the sun catches the surface, there's a very intense gleam. And I wanted to sort of remake that, have that happen more often on this site that was near a river. This is in Tampa. And I wanted it to be about the Hillsborough River, which its meanders are being shown here. And this glints in the sunlight, but it also blows like the surface of the water would be blowing. So it's this combination of capturing light and capturing wind. Because sometimes I'll see something like the wind blowing through grasses, and I want to make it happen again so that a lot of people can see it and enjoy it and get an understanding of it. And so, and maybe I bring that phenomenon of wind blowing indoors, which is always an interesting thing to work with, like bringing something that's natural into the inside has a lot of interesting sort of friction and energy. And I like to do it when I have a site that appears to be completely contained. I like to remember what is blowing through that site, what the site used to be before it was a building. And so this idea, when you're given an interior site to work on, you can think about the past ecology, the past stories of nature that happened there before you were there. Many people think about cultural stories. I'm more focused on natural history stories. And the idea of capturing certain phenomenon, light and wind are two things for indoors that I really like to work with. And, you know, I see clouds and I study the sky and think about what weather these different formations are bringing, like mare's tails, and I consult the guides to the clouds. But I often wonder, what would it be like to have your guide out on the ground so that you could kind of walk near it when you're dog walking or jogging through a park? So I was given a park in Seattle. It was very narrow, not a lot going on there, but there was a big chunk of sky. And I wanted people to sort of remember the sky. And so many times when you're walking, and I do this all the time, I'm just looking at my feet. I never look up. So it was an idea of trying to bring the changing quality of the sky down to your feet so that you would catch it as it's going forth. Sometimes it's just a blue sky. It's on the left where the kid in the yellow, right? The red shirt is climbing up on it. And sometimes it's you see cirrus or cumulus in the sky, and it's reflected in this highly reflective surface. This idea of sort of grabbing nature from one place and trying to bring it down to a human perspective is something that's very interesting when I'm given a site. That's one of the things I really look for. Like, how can I bring either nature inside or bring it into view in a way that it normally wouldn't be? And this is not my work. This is just a frozen apartment building in Siberia, which I thought, wow, the ice is being the sculptor here. But climate change, climate crisis really is something that also a lot of people are needing to translate for everyone else, because I think it's something that we don't quite have a handle on. And so this is a very important phenomenon for people to be helping to visualize, for artists to be making projects about, so you can have a sense of what's coming down the pike or we're in the midst of right now. We've seen so many charts and graphs about temperature rise and sort of what's going to happen, but we haven't felt it. And I think that's a big missing factor and why we haven't gotten climate change. We haven't brought it into our understanding, like this is really going to happen, because we haven't visualized it properly. So if you have a site that you're competing for, which is sort of the basis that I'm starting with, there's that you've been offered to do something, but you could do this even if you just said, I'm really interested in this place. There's no money attached to it. I just want to build a piece here. So I'm going to figure out about the site. I'm going to figure out about what I'm going to build, and I'll figure out about the funding later too. You can do that also. But this piece is sort of predicated on the idea that there is a site that you get to go to. And so I'm thinking about the very first steps. How do you get to know a site? I do a fair bit, but never enough research before I go. I tend to do more research after I've been. And one of the things I'm always looking for is, how does it connect to nature? And when I'm standing in that site, I'll be looking at how water is moving through the site, where the waters are coming from, where the site is on the watershed. I'll be thinking about weather. Maybe it's a particularly windy site, and it may be that I came to do something about water and watersheds, but I left thinking I really have to address the wind on the site because it's something that's very dominant and very intriguing. And I can also utilize all that wonderful wind power to generate some change in my piece. Sometimes I'm thinking about insects. I'm often thinking about bird migration or bird habitation. Is this a corridor that I can connect to a larger green wooded area or larger fields? And so I'm often looking at maps just to see the patterns that are present, very subtle things. This is Ohio. I'm not quite sure where, but there are two really interesting things going on here, where there's a trellis watershed on the upper left and a dendritic watershed on the lower left. A trellis watershed is more perpendicular and more gridded, and you can see those very straight lines that those streams are making up there, which is unusual. And the dendritic pattern from dendros, which is Greek for tree, it's a much more tree branch like pattern. Well, I wouldn't know this if I was walking in the site. This would be some information I wouldn't have with a site visit. I'd have to zoom out into the sky and see this. So it's very important to look at different views of where your site is to see all the things that are going on, because some of them are microscopic and some of them are at a scale that's too vast for you to get just by walking through. So I'm almost always checking out where I am on the watershed is one of the first things that I do. And just looking around, what's going on the site? How are people using it? How are people living there? Are people coming at certain times of the day to, say, walk their dogs? What's happening when it rains? It's really great if you have a wet site. This won't happen so much on a drier site, but if you can see what happens with the rainwater on the site, that's a great piece of knowledge to have. When I studied with Winifred Lutz, when she was given a site to do a project on, she always said, I try and spend 24 hours on that site, which is pretty arduous. She packed a picnic or two and something to sit on and lots of water and some coffee. And she really walked and sat and walked some more on the site to really let it get into her system, to really absorb it. And I think that that's a great thing to do, because sometimes when you come to a site, it's just not speaking to you, and you need to figure out how you can get access to it, how you can get that kind of emotional curiosity that you need. And spending time on the site is one of those things that you can do. And maybe there's something compelling that's going on the site that you didn't expect. I was recently in a park and I saw these incredible boulders where the algae and the mosses had drawn a lot of greenness over these they look like the tail ends of baguettes all stacked together. So I was really fascinated by that. And I've been fascinated by algae before, like this awning here in Providence, Rhode Island, which is just, it's not so super wet, but the street was just a very moist north-facing street that never seemed to dry out. And the algae was drawing itself green all over the walls. And I thought, this is where I want to, this is the thing I want to address. And it would have been something that people hadn't been aware of, that the art itself would make us aware of. And I think that is the true power of public art, is it's you're passing by without expecting to, and you're learning about the site without asking to necessarily, but it can be a very enriching education as you just by walking past the site and spending a little time looking at how the art is translating the site, if indeed the art is translating the site. And just when you see these things that a lot of people find kind of gross, or just, it's like, why would you make art about that? That's always the thing I want to make my art about. And the idea that when nature draws in green, it draws with vegetation. And the first green it draws with tends to be algae. And I think that that's a very cool thing, that is actually nature's artful act and gesture, is to draw with greenness, like it is on this fountain here. Wherever it's super wet, beautiful moss and algae are growing. There's a wonderful piece. I don't know the artist who did this. It was part of the Canadian Olympics, Winter Olympics, but it's a wonderful gutter from the building that is growing algae in the passage that it takes. And I always thought this was one of the most magnificent artworks. I really should be responsible and try and look it up. But and another piece that's all about translating algae by making it really large and lighting it. I think this is in a subway. And this is a proposal that I had about bringing the unseen algae, and also other microorganisms into view this was for a train station. And there's been a long history of cyanotypes, of making these patterns in nature still, as in stasis, and beautiful. And so that you can really see what otherwise might be a smear of green or a tinge of brown, when you take it out and you make an artful sort of gesture of its pattern, that makes it have a much more a sort of passage into your mind through beauty, which is a great way to get things into people's minds. When I'm on site, also, I'm looking at kind of other marks of history. What else has happened here before I ever stepped foot into this place? Particularly interested in water history. What's the water been doing? Has there been a history of flooding or of drought or rejiggering the path of the river? And this is a particularly rich site where there was obviously quite a bit of flooding going on, because they keep showing the lines of where things rose to. And I love plaques in that way, but I also feel like my job is to take the plaque and make it more visceral, less about words and description, and more about symbols and visual forms and evocation of the flood itself. So I'm often, when I'm on a site, I'm looking to see how things have changed. That's always an interesting point to sort of depart from. It's like, what was and what is now, and when did that change, and in what kind of increments? So that's something that's worth investigating, how things have changed. Was it always a forest? Were these railroad tracks really busy? Was there a whole town here? Did this waterway come through in a different format, or was it always in a pipe? Not. And in this case, there's been some really interesting studies about the color of rivers over time. Then this isn't very much time. This is only less than 40 years. And there's a very distinct change going on in the colors of water throughout the United States. And so that would be a point that I might jump off of when I was at a site, if there was kind of some body of water. So I'm also looking for, is there a system I want to explore? Is there something that's happening here that is different than anywhere else? And in this case, in Philadelphia, it's sort of which river you drink from is very interesting, and has sort of spawned a number of projects for me, whether you're drinking the Delaware or drinking the Schuylkill or a little bit of both, is interesting. And so the idea of illustrating a system, an infrastructure that is human built, and you want to show how nature's working with that human built infrastructure. This was a project all about drinking water I did in Philadelphia, with all the places where water is drawn before it gets to the very bottom sink on the right, which is Philadelphia. And the idea that many things have disappeared over time, things that were there are no longer there. And that's true with a lot of vegetation diversity. It's true with entire biomes like forests that were in places and then were cut down for agriculture, or cut down because the place was mined or used to burn fuel so it could make iron early on, or there was a blight, an insect blight that came through. So there are lots of different ways that things have changed. I'm looking, so when I go to a site and I want to be informed, I'm looking at that change. In this case, I'm looking at the historic waterways, which are on the bottom left, and then the current waterways that are on the surface in Philadelphia, of which there are very few. It looks like a desert in Philadelphia, and it used to be filled with streams. That missing stream scenario is very interesting to me and continues to be a source of projects, because it's just fascinating that something that was so there is no longer there. And I'm looking at what's changed underfoot. So I often, after I come back from a site, I'll look at what the site is contemporarily, and I'll look at what it was historically by looking at old maps, historic maps, which are now very wonderfully online. I used to always have to go to the library, though big state libraries often have wonderful map collections. But now you can find almost everything online, and various historical societies will have their whole collection digitized and available, and also available to do something that I never could do before the digital revolution. This is probably my favorite thing, besides my cell phone, so I can say I'm being late to an appointment. But what you can do with maps is you get onto a historical society's map database, and often you can overlay a current day map, a Google map, with a map from 1870 or 1730. And you can sort of see, though the maps are slightly different and you have to kind of stretch things a little, you can see how things have changed, because you can do a really pretty good overlay of present day versus historic times. And that is filled with fuel for possible projects on a site. And just daily occurrences we don't think of, like two rivers meeting up with completely different water qualities and water colors. I mean, that idea of the river waters changing. Some rivers have just been different from each other for a long time anyway. For whatever reason, I do believe that the right-hand side, the Arv River, is probably more polluted than the Rhone, though I don't know. So when I get home from the site, from having walked around the site, I start to I try and let these ideas percolate. I let them soak in, and I go directly to trying to address the natural processes that are on site. Sometimes I do a simple exercise of drawing all the waterways from the USGS map to see if that kind of feeds some kind of pattern language and wakes up an idea, if I haven't already come back with an idea. And I'm constantly sketching out ideas. You can see my elegant sketchbook here, a stenographer's notepad. I keep 3x5 cards in my car, because some of my better ideas have happened when I'm driving somewhere. And I'm constantly sketching and thinking, because you think you'll never forget your best ideas, and you can, or you just don't remember them as crisply as you hope to. So sketching out ideas is really, really key. I'm also sketching when I'm doing a site visit, but I also find that a lot of information comes up in my head after the site visit. And sometimes I just look to sort of some kind of series of diagrams or series of terminologies that are about the site to find a kind of inspiration if I haven't quite hit on what I want to hit on. And this is one of my favorite things. It's a comparison of marine terms in 4 or 5 different languages, like that high water is hug water. I love. So sometimes that kind of switching between languages can be very helpful to kind of free up your ideas. And I come back and think about like, oh, the comparison of all the freshwater bodies. If I'm working on a pond or a lake or something, I want to know that kind of comparison and think about that as a way of keeping my mind open and sort of seeing where my site fits into larger geologies. And I'm also thinking about what's going on in the site throughout the year, what's happening there in the spring that isn't happening in the winter, what's happening in the winter that just doesn't happen in the summer. Those are things you might want to fold into your work as you investigate time and changes of season over time on the site. And another important thing is, what about the other species that you might want to work with and support their livelihood of with birds, of eating and nesting and flying safely around. I'm often thinking about birds for projects. I sometimes use birds as my client. I'm building for them and trying to establish a better spot for them to be in by giving them better habitat, better cover, better connectivity, and then also inviting the human neighbors in and creating components of the project that are about the human neighbors understanding their avian neighbors. So when you're thinking about, okay, I've come to a site, I'm supposed to do something here, I'm a little bit stumped, think about the other things that are living there and how your project could support anything from snakes to turtles to insects, birds, and even edge species like raccoons and possums. Possums are I'm totally into possums because they eat ticks, and we're having a terrible time with ticks and Lyme disease these days. So this who else lives there kind of angle that you can take. I've done some work with bivalves because they are water filtering. They're really extraordinary creatures. We think about mussels and oysters as something yummy to eat. And we rarely think about what kind of work that they're doing out in their reefs and when they're in their beds. They filter each freshwater mussel will filter about 30 gallons, the same for marine mussels, though you can eat the marine mussels and not the freshwater ones. But to filter 30 gallons of water a day is really amazing. And I think that should be harnessed and celebrated. So I'm often looking at about how I get interested in bivalves for a particular site, and then I start researching okay, how do they do this? How do they farm oysters? And this is when you spend a lot of time going down various rabbit holes on the internet to figure out these things, unless you have a great book selection of books. I used to go to the library to find everything out. Now I use the internet. I'm lazy. So I'm looking at a lot of imagery for something as simple as farming oysters. And most people are looking at this site for farming oysters are thinking about getting some shoreline and what they're going to do to get their oysters out there and getting young oysters and how long it's going to be before they can harvest them and sell them to be eaten. And I'm looking at it as, what can this look like? How could this be an visually exciting place for people to understand how oysters are farmed? And so I've always loved this, like all these pipes that the oysters are in. I love it for its visual impact. And I love it too that it turns out to be very good habitat. And then as I'm diving into these things, I'm finding out unexpected aspects, like the freshwater shell industry, which made buttons. All buttons used to be made out of shell. And there were tons and tons of industries, even in places like Iowa, not something you think of as having a lot of shorelines, but it has a lot of streams. And there are a lot of various shellfish in there that they were using. This looks like a clam, but freshwater mussels were also used. And they're also used for the inside of pearls. Who knew that that a pearl is kind of like a turducken? It has a mussel and it's then made in an oyster. So you find out these other things that start to inform you. So that kind of open-mindedness that you have when you've seen the site and you're going back to your studio or your living room to research is really, really critical part of the public art making process. And so often I'm also doing simple diagrams, like trying to figure out how people are moving through the site. That in this case, walkers and bikers are going more dominantly one direction, but then there's the addition of drivers, and I'm kind of trying to suss that out too. So drawing yourself some simple diagrams can be very helpful for opening up your sense of the site. And of course, because I'm so water oriented, I really like to turn up at a site in the rain. And if it's a local site and our site visit hasn't been in inclement weather, I will go back when it's raining to try and take a look, or have someone who lives there that I know to take a look to see the water flowing through the site, so that I can think about ways to make that visible. What are some patterns that I could utilize to make that flow, but just down an alleyway, apparent. And so I'm constantly sort of sketching up these ideas, trying to work out the logic of how these projects work. Now, I overlay a certain amount of solution problem solving along with the visuals of the work. So I'm working two things out simultaneously, which is what's it going to look like and how's it going to do what it needs to do. Not everyone wants to take that on. That is something that I'm particularly interested in, but I have to start a lot of sort of sketching so that I can formulate the visuals of it and the function of it. And another good thing is to just make really quick models. This is a model, it's a little perspective, hard to see. It's just made out of pipe cleaners and foam. These are just things that are in my studio. No materials too cheap for models. I really think that the really fancy models are just almost idea killers, because once you've made one, you never want to change your idea because it was so arduous to create. But if it's made out of sort of junk in the kitchen drawer, your model then becomes something you can really bend and move and change and just throw out if it doesn't work. I'm also into, if possible, when we have snow, and those of us who are lucky enough to have it, snow is the most amazing piece of paper you will ever have. It is gigantic, and you can draw at full scale in the snow. And it's a great way to lay out a project or to think about the scale of an idea. Like, how big does that bench really need to be to feel right in the space, to have a sense of flow? Say you're making, and I do this, like a meandering bench. I'm actually laying out San Antonio in the snow here to see if my walls are meandering enough. And I'm out here in the snow with some, my plans, and I'm kind of testing to see if the scale is working in an outdoor setting. Meanwhile, if you're doing public art with a funded municipal source, a city or a 1% for the arts, you are probably being asked to go to a number of community meetings, which are really important and really informative. And I will say that if you don't like going to meetings, public art is probably not the best choice for you, because I spend a lot of time at meetings. But I really love to hear what people want in their communities, and what they hadn't thought about before, and sort of testing out ideas of what they might like. There's a whole sort of subset of working out how to get information from people when you can get them together at a meeting, which is a very awkward thing to do a meeting. And there are a couple other ways to skin that cat too, to not just have meetings as a way of getting to know people in the neighborhood where you're working. But if you're going to be proposing or making a piece in a neighborhood, you are not only responsible for all the other species that are in that site, but you're responsible to the neighbors, and to give them something that they can at least be proud of. They may not love it. Oh, let's see. Now we should be jamming up here. Okay, we're back. Sorry, I don't know what these glitches are. It's the wind blowing or something. You need to work with the neighbors. It doesn't mean the neighbors are designing this. You're the designer. You're the person who's going to make it happen. But you have to have an ear to what they're interested in and not go wantonly your direction, unhearing, not listening to what the community who's living right next to it is going to be walking their dogs through your piece, or playing in the sand in your piece. walking their baby carriages through it, you have to be listening. So you have to be empathic that way. And different ways of getting feedback is really interesting. Like sometimes we do like giant plans and people talk about where they live and what they want. I've started putting cars and dinosaurs on these plans so that people can talk about, how they move through the site. And then you have to continually record what everyone's saying while you're listening, which is a big juggling act. It's helpful to have someone who's kind of the secretary is recording, but you want these large pieces of memo for later, because you will spread these out in your studio and look at them and think about what everyone said and what everyone wanted. Now, the lesson is you can't give everyone what they want, but you can listen and try and get to something of what they want. Meanwhile, while you're doing meetings with your neighborhood, you're also doing, you're presenting to different groups who are involved in it, who are giving you the permission to go ahead with your project, or the other disciplines involved. And so here I'm presenting to an arts association, like an overseeing association. And my idea is only in a sketch form at this point. It's black and white. It's the cutouts on the table. But we're having an early meeting and talking about the potential of the project. And I have to be presenting my ideas, not totally wedded to them in case I'm going to have to change something, but with a fairly firm idea and a simple way to show people what's going on. And then this is the time that if you are doing a collaborative project, which I almost always am doing, that you're collecting your team, you're getting your team together to work together on this project. Sometimes a team is already established when you first go into a project, and you've been working with them from day one. But sometimes the artist is the lead on the project, and I then, if I'm the artist and I get the project, need to assemble my engineer, and if I need a landscape architect, and maybe I need an ecologist, I need to go out and find those people to have them join my team. And they join my team because I'm going to pay them for their services. They're not joining my team because they think I'm wonderful. But this collaborative process, you want to start it early. You don't want to come to your engineer with a fully designed plan and say, hey, can you make this happen? You need to talk to your engineer early on and say, I'm thinking about this, and can we do it this way? And kind of brainstorm about the possibilities. Now, it's funny, I went through so many pictures, and yet I could not find a picture of me collaborating with an engineer, mostly because it's just the two of us in a room or on the phone nowadays. And I'm too busy to take a picture. So it's really funny when I notice that there's like lacks of activities that I have, and the collaborative activities are rarely photographed unless someone happens to be on site doing it. I do also collaborate with other disciplines, with ecologists and scientists, and I will say go up to their lab to talk about, in this case, I'm talking about diatoms in the East River. This is in Connecticut. It's a NOAA station where they're doing a lot of testing on the Long Island Sound, which is fed by the East River. And so Judy, my scientist, is looking at the diatoms that are swimming in the East River, and those are the diatoms that I want to picture in my project. So I'm working with her to figure out who's swimming there and which ones are the most important species. And these kind of collaborations are very, very interesting because they get you out of the studio, they get you into other people's lives, they make you question your work. You have to negotiate to figure out if your idea really is going to mesh, with, say, diatoms. The diatoms I really loved, they don't happen to be swimming in the East River, so I can't use them. And so my little fantasy of, oh, this is my favorite diatom was kind of dashed because Judy's telling me that's not there. But that's part of the working through when you're working with other disciplines, which I really like. And if you like doing that, then public art is a really wonderful conveyance for working with other people. But it is, if you don't like doing it, it makes it really difficult because there's a lot of time spent with other disciplines, and it's really one of the best parts, but you don't want to not enjoy the best parts. So I'm also doing a lot of preliminary drawing. They're sort of the art committee or the funder may be asking for several ideas or isn't certain what they want, and I'm sort of still searching. This is, months after the site visit. I'm saying, how about this? Can I work here? Can I work there? Because I'm not an X marks the spot kind of artist that throws things on a pedestal. It's very tricky for me to find a site that satisfies my curiosity. I want a site that's very active or that I can make very active. And the client who wants kind of in the end had probably envisioned a piece on a pedestal with something that's kind of silver and shiny, and they're not going to get that from me. So I have to do a fair bit of negotiation of where this piece is going to be. So I have to do a lot of like, how about here? How about there? If not here, how about these things over here? So there's a kind of negotiation dance that goes on. And I'm also, meanwhile, this is in the Philadelphia airport, I'm looking at the site. By this time, I have, say, the architect's plans. I have a site plan, and I'm looking at features like where, if you stand in a certain area, where is your view shed? Where are you? How does circulation happen? How do people move through this site? You don't want to make a piece in a backwater that nobody's going to get to unless you're going to get them there somehow. But if you're looking for a kind of passive passage of your audience, then you need to really know the flow of the site. And that's by watching it and studying it and then sort of jotting that on the plan. And this is a rather formalized version of the view sheds because I wanted to show why I was putting my piece throughout the airport. This is a baggage carousel area, and why I wasn't doing it in an X marks the spot kind of situation. So here is a perspective, a digital perspective, which in this day and age has become the kind of coin of the realm. You need to have. I do not do these drawings myself, being a bit of a Luddite, and but I find people who can, usually much younger people, and I pay them very nicely for the work that they do. I need to translate my sketchy ideas into digital drawings, and if you're an amazing drafts person, then you could probably get away from the step, but I'm not such a great drawer, so I have to utilize other people's digital drawings of my ideas as part of my proposal. And here I am thinking out, there's someone who wants to come in the waiting room, how this whole thing's going to fit on these different walls. I realized how much easier it'd be if I would just make one big damn bronze sculpture and stick it on a pedestal. I think life would be easier, but maybe not. So I'm sketching out ideas, which I sketch out, and then I have someone draw up as possibilities because there's a lot of stages where I'm showing the architects, the engineers, the people who own the building, who may or may not be the client, the airport, say, who's overseeing United, who's doing this, and it was US Air for a while. And so there are a lot of people that I have to communicate my beginning ideas to, and digital drawings are unfortunately the fastest way to do this. But I also do a lot of sketching because I need to figure things out that I'm working with the people who are supplying things like the stone or supplying a certain part of the fabrication, in this case, the sandblasting. So this is me writing to my sandblaster, oftentimes jotting this down, taking a phone picture, sending it via text. It's someone that I have already established a relationship with this sandblaster, but I need to be talking about what I need to have them do. And so lots of questions come up, and these questions are often best answered with sketches or diagrams. And so I get very used to creating a lot of diagrams, depending on who I'm talking to. Sometimes they're the digital version, and sometimes they're the Stacy Levy hand-done versions. And oftentimes you have to create a kind of overall idea that's going to pull something about this project through. Like maybe there's not enough funding at this point, so they need a drawing that will give people an idea, a sense of what's going to be built. And so you end up doing a lot of drawing that sort of it may not be exactly how it's going to work out, but it has something to do with your idea. And it's a way of starting funding or acceptance. So that you can see that there's just lots of drawings and thinking going out with all different lengths and trajectories. So I'm in the studio, I'm drawing diatoms. That's my old dog who's almost always asleep on my things. Then I'm talking with the landscape architects about, can I have 6 patterns, or can I put them all over? Do I have to put them in like discrete areas? Are these going to be ADA, American for the Disabilities? Are they going to be compliant with that? There's my dog again. Then I'm going back to the studio and casting my idea into reality, doing a series of prototyping, seeing what this all looks like. Meanwhile, I'm having to think, and you, who's ever doing public art, will also think about this too, thinking about maintenance. The long-term maintenance of whatever you're making is going to be part of the life of your project and is going to affect the life of your project too. And you have to build that sense of maintenance in very early in the game. And so that's while you're talking to your fabricator, while you're meeting your collaborating scientist, while you're presenting to the architects, you're meeting with the community, you're also constantly thinking about maintenance. Who's going to do it? Is it a privately owned situation where they have somebody that they could say, yeah, after a storm, they'll go out and hose it down? Or will nobody ever touch it again? And more sites than not won't ever be touched again. And so you need to kind of work out what needs to be done yearly, what needs to be done after events like this. This is a flooded area across a lot of bluestone. There's a lot of debris that needs to be hosed off and swept off. And who's going to be responsible for that? So you start to work that out with your client. But the first thing you need to do is figure out what it's going to need. And who looks after living materials? That's even more tricky. It's one thing to say you need to sweep this. It's another thing to say you need to weed out the non-native perennials. Not everyone's going to have the skill set for that. So sometimes as part of what you're doing, you can endow maintenance within the project if you have a very big budget. And that is probably the best thing you can do. And I also think it's a wonderful thing because then it means your public art is creating a job for someone else or a part-time job for someone. So there's something great about that too. And you're being responsible to the long term. You're not just throwing it out there and saying, it'll be fine, because it won't be fine. It's going to need some assistance from somebody after a flood or after a big tree limb falls on it, or when all the plants start growing in. And something as simple as, won't someone sweep it out? This is a project that's at a school. They've got a whole lot of people who could potentially sweep it out. They just may never think to do that. And I've been told before, putting up a project for the city of Philadelphia, they said they're not even going to change a light bulb for you, which I find kind of astounding, because people are able to change light bulbs and to do maintenance. It's just that most people reject the idea of maintenance. So we as responsible artists need to remember that maintenance is part of the life and lifeblood of your piece. And you have to figure out, you may need to assign someone to look after the components. This is not my project, but it's a giant chessboard in a park in San Antonio. And I watched this guy be early out on a site that was adjacent to this. And this guy would come every morning and put the chess pieces out, and then every evening take the chess pieces in. That's a paid position. That's part of the overall park maintenance. And if the person who designed this, probably a landscape architect, put that into the overall maintenance contract, that somebody would be doing that, so that this sort of giant chess set that's out in the park will continue to work. And part of the responsibility to maintenance is testing out your materials. You really need to know what your materials can do and what's going to happen to them over time. And you want to test out different materials, anything from the actual different steel or different metals to the different adhesives you might be using. and starting to prototype becomes really, really essential because they're wonderful things you learn. This is a prototype of the Ontario Science Center piece. And it's an interesting story. I used polished granite that I sandblasted most of it away. If you know anything about polished granite, you basically can make a skating rink of polished granite if it gets wet. It's really slippery. And so I couldn't have that for safety reasons. I couldn't have a whole sheet of polished granite, but I could have a strip that maybe maxed out at 2 inches wide because nobody has that small a foot who would slip on it. They would always have some of their foot on a grippier sandblasted surface, but I could still have the beautiful glinting silvery quality of the polished granite. And remember, I'm completely infatuated with silver glinting of waterways. So I wanted to make sure that I could get the silver glint when the sun hit it from a certain angle, but it wasn't too slippery. And it became this. So you can see the polished is dark, but it's still, when the sun hits it, it reflects in a kind of silver. And then the grippy surface is the lighter color. So I'm often making full scale prototypes, and they're very expensive to make. They require the same robust materials that you're going to use. Sometimes I talked about those, cheap models made out of kitchen drawer scraps. They're also, when you're prototyping, they're the actual materials you're going to use made at the scale that you're going to put the thing in. But they're also smaller prototypes too. Here I am testing out something on the Schuylkill River. It's all been jammed into my car, and I'm loading it up to launch them. I need to take these out into boats and put them in the river and see if they work, because almost everything works in your studio and very few things work outside of your studio. So I'm putting them out in the river to see how they succeed. Is my proof of concept going to work, or is it going to fail? In this case, yes, this looks beautiful floating there, and it was responding to the tide, but it was also responding to the wind. And I would have to figure out a way to weight the petals, because this material wasn't heavy enough to hold the petals down when the wind hit it. So that's not going to work, because I don't want to have 25 of these out in the river all, looking like they're trying to hide their faces and not knowing when they'll blow back correctly into their floral positions. But here's a simple and quick one where I also wasn't as developed in this one project, but I wanted to see what it might do. So I'm taking sort of scraps of the red material that I use for the petals and tying it to scraps of wood that I'm then going to screw into scraps of leftover industrial infrastructure to test my proof of concept, my prototype. Will this tell the tide somehow? So here it is, it's low tide, and here it is at high tide. So yes, it is functioning. It's doing pretty well. It's having an interaction that I couldn't have in my studio. I don't have a tide in my studio. I don't even have a tide in my pond where I test a lot of my watery things out. So I needed to see what it would do in reality. There were things I didn't expect, like how long it would be under and how much algae would grow on it. But I sort of liked the way it looked, but it got completely kiboshed by the client, who didn't like the way it looked because they felt it looked like a red oil spill when I was trying to imitate algae. And this is where the public art park gets a little tricky, because you are not just building for yourself. And the sun has just come out here. I'm going to just shift my, let's see if we can do this over here. This is not art that you're making completely on your own. This is art that you're making in a sort of collaborative situation where a lot of the choices are not solely yours to make, and you have to be open to changes, because sometimes your ideas go down and it's perfect and you run with them, and sometimes your most favorite ideas are not digestible to the powers that be, and you have to change things. I do a lot of these small, quick models to sort of see how things are working scale-wise. Once again, my blue pipe cleaners, which I have a tremendous supply of, but this is just typing paper and carefully cut, to scale pipe cleaners. And then I'm using some kind of foam or something to make this other thing. I'm building right on a version of the plan, another copy of the plan. That's a quick and easy way of figuring out what things are going to look like in scale. Plans are very tricky to read. I have a lot of experience looking at them, but it's very hard for me to look at a plan and really get a sense of the elevation or the 3D-ness of it. So I want to build it up a little bit. Those little wire looking things are people for my scale, at 5.5 feet. And then I usually force myself to build a full scale kind of quickie model. This is made out of cardboard, taped together, and then painted. So I've moved from those little quickie models to a quickie full scale model. And knowing what something's going to look like in the landscape is really, really important. You can really screw up if you think it's pretty big because it's filling up your studio. You take it outside and it shrinks like crazy in the big environment of the great outdoors. And all of a sudden, your piece, which seemed to fill your studio and seems so gigantic, looks puny and out of scale with the entire context of the site. So testing for scale is essential. And if it means, making some mistakes with cardboard, that's okay, because it's always better to make your mistakes on the cheap material and not to make them when it's painted steel that someone has welded up for you that's really 3 sizes too small for the site. Another thing that you have to contend with is how colors look different. They look very different inside your studio than out in bright sunlight where they fade quite a bit. So I'm always taking color samples outside and not making any decisions about paint colors or pigmentation until I've looked at it in the great outdoors to make sure it really works in the blazing sun and that those colors are as saturated as you hope that they would be. So you're always testing to see if things will work in reality. And this constant testing out of scale as you're testing materials, like I'm often making half-size models or quarter-size models because I simply can't put in the whole thing. But this is me testing things out on my pond. One of the things is that I live out in a rural area so that I have lots of land to lay things out on, which has made my life quite a bit easier. I used to just sort of find places that wouldn't be disturbed and lay things out on public land and do a lot of trespassing when I was younger to put something out there that I could go revisit. Now I've moved up to a pond, but still, I love having a pond, but it doesn't have a tide. So it doesn't always tell me exactly what's going on. So here I am in a little boat to get things out. I'm trying to figure out if this is going to work. Testing its scale, like is the scale working? I know this isn't full scale, it's at quarter scale, but how does that look? I need to see it in reality. I do not rely on my computer drawings. I don't rely on either hand drawings or digital drawings to tell me what something's going to look like in reality, because I've just seen things that look great in drawings turn out to be really boring or too small or not right for the site when they get out in the site with their real materials. So testing things out is really key to make sure that your project is going to be successful when it gets out there. This is the spiral jetty, many of you know, by Robert Smithson. This is the piece that I'm imitating this piece with my piece. I'm imitating and paying homage to it because it was one of the early environmental pieces. Robert Smithson goes out in the middle of nowhere, the Great Salt Lake, and says, I want to do this gesture. It's really huge. That's a horse down in the left-hand corner. This thing is big. And there are people on it too, you can see, just barely make out. It's really big. The scale is amazing and wonderful. But it's a big, hard piece that doesn't have, I don't know, it's not doing anything within the environment where it is. It's just a gesture, a heroic artistic gesture, which I have admired for years, but I felt like I don't want to go that direction. So I made a version of the spiral jetty, which I called spiral wetland, which is a floating wetland, which is treating the pollution in the lake. And it's engineered to do that. I'm working with engineers and ecologists to make sure that that's a possibility, that is a function that this thing will do while it looks beautiful and also gives habitat to turtles and to other birds and to fish. All right, I'm going to run you through at some point, and you can tell me if you if you need a, what do we have? We're at 5:10. If you need a break, if you stand up and get a glass of water or something, you're not going to miss everything. But I will run you through right now a project from concept to construction so that you can kind of see how this goes. This is not something I ever was shown when I first started out. I didn't know that you started in one place over here and you went this way and this way and this way and ended up perhaps in another place entirely. I had no idea how this process went. Many of you might know, you might be extremely familiar and have done it 20 times yourselves, but I'm going to share this with you because I feel like this has been a mystery to me for many years, even, and I'm just finally getting it. So here I am. This is a project down in North Carolina, in just north of Charlotte. I've been basically given this site, so it's I'm in. I'm working with the architects and landscape architects and museum designers for this new environmental center that they're putting in, and also the park and rec people are there, Parks and Rec, and lots of people from the city. And so the room is filled, and that's my design team. It's like 20 people, the design team, and I'm brought in as the artist. And fortunately, I'm brought in very early, which is really, really important to me because I often build my pieces into the overall system on the site. And if I was brought in too late, I can't penetrate the different systems and latch onto them and make them slightly different so that they can have another kind of function, either dealing with other natural processes that the landscape architect and building architect sort of forgot about, or inviting other species in. All the things that I consider my job, I can't do if I come in too late to the site and it's not collaborative. I need to collaborate very early. So here we are. It's a nature center about a creek. And so I'm thinking, well, then I really want to get people involved in the idea of water and water flowing across the landscape, which will go into the creek very early on. I want them to have that right when they drive their car in. I'm always interested in people's initial entrance into a site and that transition of driving in and then getting out of your car and walking to something. And what you see when you're in the parking lot, when you're primed, there's often nothing for you to see. And I want to serve the person getting out of the car. So here I am talking about how you start on the road. Somewhere there's a pointer in this world, but I'm not going to confuse us all. And you can follow the red arrows. There's the driving experience, and you can see this is a concept drawing. There's no art actually happening here. It's thinking about what the art will do. You're driving and then you're parking. And then you have a walking experience down to the creek that this site is sort of celebrating. And the architects and landscape architects were all very interested. And then I tried to figure out, this is where the art begins. My concept is to have a meandering stream of red stem dogwoods, which meanders through the site. And within that, there would be these wind-driven pieces, so you can sort of think about seeds and flow and the same pattern that is informing water, and how water flows is also informing the wind, because it's all about liquids and gases. And so there's trying to bring those things together. And you can see the parking lot in green when you pass through, and I'm dealing with the cars and the people. The landscape architects said, no, we're not doing this. And the architects were like, yeah, that wasn't really what we had in mind. And so everyone's like, this isn't what we have in mind. So I could have fought it, but I wasn't in a place where I really wanted to do that. I didn't want to I didn't feel so strongly about this that I couldn't say, okay, back to the drawing board. So then I was thinking, okay, that, I would like to explore water in the site, but maybe I have to be more specific. What is it that I really want to have people understand about the site? And the site is the stream. It's a lovely creek, which has actually was sort of straightened out during the highway construction, and they're putting the meanders back in. And I really love meanders, and I think it's a pattern that we all should be more familiar with. So I'm starting to see it's about the meanders. I'm going to build something that that gives the viewer, gives the people who are using this museum, this sense of meanders. And maybe I can make it a kinetic sense. And I happen to love crossing over wet areas on hard, dry things like docks or walkways, boardwalks. So I thought, I think I want to make that experience happen too. I find that I often draw on experiences that, seminal experiences of my childhood. I really love being on a dock. I really love walking across boardwalks on a wetland. That's just fun. And I think about all the places I did that. And so I make them for other people again. There's this wonderful piece, I think this is in Germany, and I'm looking sort of around at what people do with boardwalks. Now, you could never do this in America. Liability, way too problematic for that. But this idea that it rises up and takes you on this meandering walk through the canopy, I thought was really, really great. I'm also looking for something that's porous, because if I want to be over something wet, I want the rain to be able to drop through it, and I want the plants to come up through the mesh too. I've had an experience already with my rain yard piece. I know that I want to replicate that plants up, rain down relationship. So I'm looking for materials that I can use as a walkway. What's perforated? Can I afford it? Is it a material that is going to be ADA approved? So I'm looking for something that drains and that has a porosity to it. And I'm also looking at people who've done other things with grading. This is Jessica Stockholder, and I want to see, what people are doing. And if my idea has already been done, I will steer clear of that. But who else is working with this kind of material, and what can it do? And I'm also always looking at where this material is being used in a more sort of pedestrian way. I'm at a ferry terminal, and all of a sudden I see this material. And so like, this is really great stuff. I really like the way it feels underfoot. I like the way it's put together. And I start to research that. And then my big question is, this is gray. Can I get this turned into a color? Because I really love floating colors. I think they look just amazing against the green of the vegetation. So I find a company that makes this stuff, and it's called Sea Safe. And I start having color tests to see if it really can take the pigment that I wanted to take. I'm using the RAL, which is it's like the Pantone system, only it's its own system. And RAL tends to be a more industrial color line. So I have my own, it's just a single sheet of colors, and auto paint uses it, and powder coating uses it. So I'm choosing which RAL I want to look into. And then they're sending me samples. They're sending me samples. That last sample was by phone, and this sample is mailed to me, so I can look at them outdoors, because what looks great in someone's office is not necessarily going to be the right thing when you take it outside. Once again, this like proof of concept, get it outdoors if it's going to be outdoors. And I'm still looking into, like, if I make this meandering stuff, can I slope the sides? Can I have kind of a topography going here? Can I use different materials, one for the major ADA passage, and then one that's not ADA approved, that's maybe a different kind of metal, and where it overlaps with the proposed building? I've been working at this point with the architects and landscape architects, no pictures because we're madly working and I never stop to take a picture, trying to figure out where I can build this project so that it means something to the building. So, and what I'm doing is creating an entranceway from the parking area at the top of the drawing here. It's gray, it says parking area. And the bus will drop groups of kids, school kids off, or tours off, and they will take this meandering walkway into the building instead of the straight access path, which is concrete, that the building architect designed as just quick and easy way of getting in the building. My feeling is I want people to have an experience of the meanders before they go and study a meandering stream. I want them to have a kinetic sense of what a meander feels like if you run through this path. And so I'm then creating, with the help of my tech savvy youth, 3D models to show what this looks like. So this is a very important step, because I can't build a full scale model. I want to know what it looks like, and I need to translate this to the landscape architects and to the building architects. We need to be able to sort of look at this drawing and all have an understanding of it. And 3D models are a very excellent way for everyone to be on the same page. So this is an important component of creating projects, is to be able to model them so that you don't build them before everyone is able to say, oh, that's not going to work here, or this, we need to pin this into here, or let's move this rock. Like in this case, they wanted to move these boulders into the mesh. I wanted to do that, but they came up with that idea too. So I was very glad to do that so that it would fit in more and seem more natural. So here's my first digital go through, and I'm saying, I want this broad, porous blue walkway across the detention basin. So all of that grass that you see there is wet area. It's all a wet meadow, and you wouldn't really want to walk there most of the year. But then I'm getting some feedback and pushback, which is I need to make a kick plate so wheelchairs and baby carriages will not roll off. In Europe, I would not need this kick plate because people think that humans are more sensible. But in America, everyone assumes that you're a fool and that you're just going to not be able to control yourself and you're going to roll right off and drop down. So I have to put a kick plate on, which I don't want to do, but I have no choice. If I want to build this meandering walkway, I've got to comply with the expectations of the client and the ADA. And I'm creating a sort of a materials board of all the things that I want to do. It's the walkway, it's carved stone in a place, and I wanted to do a bunch of glass insets into the parking lot. So you sort of have these breadcrumbs that start your journey from the car all the way to through the meander into the Nature Center Museum. And I'm getting specs or specifications from the manufacturer about the material that I want to use to start to introduce the material to my engineer and talk about how this is going to work and where the pitfalls are, where it's not going to work. Like we have these screws, is this going to be okay? Do we need to have another kind of fastening system? So these specifications from the manufacturers are very, very important component of my work. And I'm working with the engineer online, some of it, and on the phone, because it's there in Charlotte. And I'm by this time, I've probably run out of trips that I can take down there. An average project takes 7 trips just in the design phase, the pre-construction phase. That's not even the installation part. But there's a lot of back and forth. So we end up a lot on the phone, and now we end up on Zoom, which is actually in some ways almost easier than the phone because sharing a screen really works very well. So I'm talking with my engineer and we're talking about every single component of this piece. And then I'm about to present my proposal with my full budget and everything else. And they're doing soil samples, and they find out that they're about to put the building on a landfill, and they come to a screeching halt. And I have no idea if that means that this thing will never be built and this whole project is going to go into the waste basket or not. And so I'm within 3 hours before my presentation, I get a call from my arts manager who says, we're not having a meeting today. We just found out some bad news. The building is on hold. And I finally find out it's because an engineer made a massive mistake and did not see that there's this big patch of landfill where a huge section of the building was going to stand. And if the landfill shifted, then the whole building would shift. And in 10 years, the whole building could be falling apart. So smart that they located that problem early on before they started building. But that screws me up because remember when I said that my pieces are sewn into the building? Well, I'm so sewn in that if the building shifts, then my pattern can no longer connect the parking lot and the bus drop off to the front door of the building. And I've gone from what's circled in orange to now what's sort of circled in the dashed blue line. I have a lot less space to work in. And I've basically been pinched out of my original site. And this is having done most of the design work. So I go back to the drawing board. I also negotiate an additional payment to pay myself for more additional design and to pay my engineer, because once I redesign it, they will have to redesign it also. And they're a lot more expensive than I am. So the new site, instead of it being on both sides of the sidewalk, it's now on one side of the sidewalk because there's not enough to be on both sides of the entrance in order to connect to the parking lot. It's a different form. It's not quite as wonderful as it started out to be, but it's a salvage piece that otherwise wouldn't be able to be built. So we're sort of refiguring how it's going to work. I want it to be one size. All of a sudden, I can't afford that with my budget. So we're doing a lot of testing. You can see the overlay of the black versus the blue. Blue is too big. I'm paring it down to be the black. So I'm redrawing this curve a lot over a month. And finally, we get it down and the engineer draws it up for steel fabrication. And I pay him a lot of money, but I really love working with this engineer. So I'm happy to pay him a lot of money. And there's just so many components to collaborate with. I have a design that I want to have a certain integrity. And at the same time, I have to fit it into the road, the parking lot, and to these places that are going to be cast in concrete where the front door of the building is going to be. And I have to make sure that those cast concrete areas are going to be at the correct levels, in this case, 669.7. In order to keep my piece flat, it has to be connecting to these two pink areas. And so I have to keep an eye on that and get that survey to make sure that those contact points are correct. Because if I take my piece in and one of those is 2 feet wrong, or even 6 inches wrong, I've got serious problems to contend with. So I need to, all through the building construction, I need to keep an eye on these special contact points where my piece is going to touch the rest of the site. And I need to make sure that they are being built perfectly to specification and not having some kind of wild card thing. And so I'm having them surveyed, which I'm also paying for. And then there are issues on a finer grain where my mesh is fitting together. I'm trying not to do banding. I just want everything to abut, but it's making a very jagged edge, and it's not going to be ADA certified because we just can't work the material to have a perfectly smooth edge. So it turns out now I need to add some banding, and I'm starting to dig into my contingency. But we do get this, the grid and the edges worked out, and here's what I'm handing off to the steel fabricator and also the people who are going to be installing it. They have this guide, this beautiful plan, which has the look of what I want, and I'm hoping it's going to turn into what I want, and it's very beautifully engineered too. So it's taken about 3 years to get to this point. And so we have excavation, and then putting in my foundations for that's holding up the spine. This is like a monorail the whole thing's built off of. And then we're fitting the grating onto that sort of snake spine with ribs, steel ribs, and setting that into the sidewalk, which I had to create a template for those, what you see in blue right here, a huge template that had to be made down in North Carolina and brought over to the site and fitted into the site so that the sidewalk, the concrete, would have an opening for my pieces when they were brought onto the site. And there it is in the excavated site. We had a lot of issues with rain. It was a very wet summer. And but it does, I mean, that blue just looks stunning to me against the rust. There's the retention basin holding the water. So this is basically crossing a wetland. And there it is growing in a little bit more later in the summer. So that's that project, which was probably was about 5 years in the making. And it had to be built during COVID. And I never got down there. I did it all by phone. But the initial desires for the meandering stayed in. So that it's like, to me, the test of whether the art is working is if that original idea still feels embedded in the project. does it still feel like meanders, or did that get sort of committee planned out? But it still did have a lot of twists and turns. And so that was a great thing. I think we should take a break now, which is going farther into this. So we're at 5:30. And let's do some questions, and then I'll go over some budget proposal and kind of the brass tacks of how that works too. But let's do some question and answer too. I'll just leave the screen up.
Wonderful.
Do we have any
Everyone,
questions?
actually, I encourage everybody to come off of mute to ask Stacy questions.
Sure,
I feel
that's
like
fine.
That makes it a little bit easier. I feel like these questions could be a little more involved depending on the work. And I know that
Okay.
our own Mac Love has been asking some questions in the chat. So Mac, if you want to kick us off. Or anyone else, that's fine too.
Don't be shy.
Oh, hold on one second. I'm being told they're not allowed to unmute themselves. One moment. Thanks, Mac. Hold on. Sorry. All right.
I think you should be able to now, Mac. See
Yep.
if I did it. Okay.
I'm good.
Thanks.
Don't
Sorry,
mind
that was
the
my
bubble
fault,
balloon
not yours.
behind me. Sorry, I'm just in the kitchen, so I might not be able to ask too many questions here. But Stacey, I was curious if you'd had an opportunity yet to come to Akron, and if there were any environmental details here that really inspired you or intrigued you.
Oh, I haven't had a chance to come to Akron because it's all been sort of COVIDization. I'm looking forward to it. And I got to say, the river it's tremendously interesting to me, but also I'm always interested in all the water that feeds into the river, like where it comes from and how it gets to its the lowest position in the grade of water flow. And so I'm interested in how all of the waters are converging into the river. So that's something I'd probably look into.
If I can ask one more, because I had.
Oh, you can ask as many questions you
just
want. That's great.
I was curious how often you find that the original budget plan for the RFP actually covers the amount of work required. And I was curious how you go about communicating that. I know you might get to it later.
No, that's a really good question. It's the artist's responsibility to take the budget and make sure the budget fits what's being done. Nobody's going to say, oh, it looks like you're going over budget a little bit and we feel sorry for you, so we're going to add another $50,000. The budget is a very fixed thing usually. And there are times, like if they ask you to do a redesign after you've just designed the whole thing, you do have a foot to stand on to say, I need more money now that I'm going back for redesign. But they have to go back to a committee and ask for that money. It is not immediate, and it could be another 3-month delay. So whatever you're given as a budget, that's what you have, and you cannot build beyond that budget. So you can't make promises that are beyond the budget. And you have to kind of build in a certain amount of expectation that things will take longer. You think, oh, I probably can do that in four meetings on the phone. They're going to be 8 meetings on the phone. So there's a lot of times where I'm just sort of doubling things. And it's where the contingency comes in, which I'll talk about a little bit when we do go over the budget, but I'll talk about now too. You really need to have a slush fund. In construction, there's something called a change order, and people who are doing construction are like, we didn't know this was going to be wet. We didn't know we were going to hit bedrock here. And so can charge more, can add to the price of their contract. Art contracts are not written that way. It's like, this is all you get unless it's, well, they don't even say unless it's really bad. So that is what you get. So you have to design to that. If you have $5, you do not make a $6 piece. You make a $4.50 piece and have 50 cents in case something goes wrong. And that's why people say, what do you want to build here? I'm like, what do you want to pay me to build something here? Because that will dictate a lot of things, whether I'm going to use, paper or steel. Depends on the budget. So the budget is really critical to think of as almost its own entity, and also be very, very honest with everyone who's working with you that the budget is fixed and you've parsed it all out. I don't share my budgets with anyone except the people I have to share it with, but I have to have parsed out what I'm going to pay everyone, because if I don't give enough money, don't put aside enough money for something, like say the engineer, I'm like, well, I really only want to give the engineer $2,000. And I then go talk to the engineer and they'll say, well, that will be $10,000 for me to do the work on this. I'm in some deep doo-doo. Now, sometimes you can rob Peter to pay Paul from your budget, but if you're constantly finding that it costs more than you expected, it's impossible to continue to rob Peter, because poor Peter has nothing left. So you want to have, before you've dive in, you want to have some sense of how much your things are going to cost. And there's a whole kind of, it's like you move forward with your design, then you see if your budget's keeping up. And then it turns out that this isn't going to keep up. So it drops down. So then your design has to drop down to meet the budget. But then you're like, well, if it's over here, maybe I'll make it go like this. Can I make this happen? So it's a lot of push me, pull you going on between budgets and what you're doing. And that gets better the more you do it. That's true. But you can still make some terrible mistakes. And I wake up at 3 a.m. on a number of projects going, oh my God, I didn't think about this, or who knew that the price of this would go up? The China tariffs brought to you by that scary man who used to be our president was really a disaster for artists, because a lot of materials got tied up and they could no longer afford anything. So,
I can't, buddy.
What?
I can't.
Sorry, are you having trouble hearing? Okay.
I think there was someone who just came off mute, but I just want to say thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation. I look forward to it.
Good. Thank you. I'm glad. I hope it helps, because this one is really about like trying to figure out how to do this. I've been doing that for a while, so I'm really happy to kind of share my knowledge.
Stacy, I'm going to throw Matt under the introduction bus here and thank Matt from our University of Akron Biomimicry Center is with us today. So he's been such a wonderful partner as we explore this unique position that Summit County is relative to arts and the environment. So thank you, Matt, for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I had a two-part question. One is and if you come to Akron, I'll invite you to the labs at UA, and we're active in all different disciplines, connecting that to art and the ecology. The city of Akron has a lock system, waterways, about, I think it's like 20 locks that makes the elevation drop within a couple miles. Goes like down like 500 feet or something.
Wow.
So it's a pretty 19th century engineering feat. It also runs through an area of a displaced neighborhood called the Inner Belt, which was a African-American neighborhood that got moved because of the highway going through back in the day when that was pretty common in a lot of cities. So in the context of water and access and water and health of a community, which I think you're probably quite sympathetic to, how do you address those kind of social issues that are obviously very of our moment in the context of these kinds of ecological puzzles?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a complicated thing to do. Partially because we have such a huge learning curve about our water system, and just the idea that if you turn on your tap, where is it coming from and how's it being processed? And then questions come up about, is this safer, or should I be drinking bottled water? And depending on where you are, there are different answers to that. I'm kind of like a primer of where water goes. Like the thing that I'm really trying to address is, how can you track water that falls as rain down to the low point, and how does it interact with your life in that way? That's where I start from, because it's that itself is not all that simple, but it affects everybody. And right now, that's my way of sidestepping the justice issues that are really massive when you start, even when you map out a watershed in a city and you start collecting water and see the quality of water in certain parts, in certain neighborhoods, and that water has been put underground and not a place for anyone to play, and the water quality is bad, so you probably wouldn't want your kids in it anyway. It becomes very obvious about the tremendous inequities of water and how it's treated. But I'm on this sort of like first step of just introducing people in a very basic way to the fact that this is what you're drinking. Most people have no idea which waterway they're drinking. And I feel that if they get to know what they're drinking, then they'll be more savvy about keeping an eye on it too, and not letting people who were trying to save a buck change around their water system. So knowledge is power in this case, but I'm at the very rudimentary beginning of introducing the idea of how water flows through a city and how it's changed over time. So awareness is probably what I'm doing. I'm not actually getting into the social justice, though I'm a huge proponent of that. I don't have the skills for it, and I don't have, it's sort of not exactly how I work, because it requires a lot of time on the site and involvement and political involvement, which I haven't been able to manage as someone who's kind of itinerant as an artist. I'm never paid to be on the site as long as you need to be paid to get to have a real impact. I also happen to have a family and I couldn't be away for a year, but I'm trying to do what I can with awareness with the budgets that I get to work with. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you.
Okay, I see that there's questions here. Should I, because I'm looking at the chat too. I'm not sure I'm going up high enough, but I see from Mac about how do I like to collaborate with local communities and residents. I love that part of the project. And do I offer mentorship opportunities for local artists? Not so much per se, unless, that's sort of like they glom onto me, but I do a lot of opportunities for students to get together to work with me to, say, collect water for short-term projects and sometimes for long-term projects too. The more things you do in a community, the more enmeshed you become, which is a really great thing. And so different scales of projects are really a nice way to create a deeper relationship with the community that you're working with. Typically, as a public artist, you're brought in for a single long-term commission that's a permanent commission. And they're not always anticipating much more than a series of community meetings. And I've been trying to sort of change that around a little by not just having meetings, but also by having short-term activities that people can participate in so that we can get to learn more about water or whatever issue we're talking about and sort of activate time together, which is really important and very informative to me as an artist collecting research about which direction I should be going. And I think it's just plain fun for everybody. So a whole new way for people to look at their neighborhood. So I'm finding that I'm preferring to do, if I have a long-term commission, I'd like to do a couple of short-term projects around that commission, especially during the very, very long gap between, hey, we have an artist on board, to, oh, she finally did her piece. Sometimes that can be 5 to 7 years. So to fill in that time, I think that's a really great time to do a series of short-term pieces. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. It depends. Artist support, I'm always happy to talk to artists, but it's not my major goal, because local artists are often doing their own thing really well. But when we do a project and when we're installing it, I often put a call out to artists that I will be paying to do parts of the installation, and we'll be working together. And then that's a wonderful way for me to get involved in the arts community and for me to sort of informally teach artists like how to do what I do. But I don't have a proper mentorship set up. And how do you track and communicate your hours to clients? You don't, because your client doesn't care how many hours they're taking of your time, because they know that they're going to be paying you, $100,000, and they want to pay you the money and get the thing and have you jump through all the hoops you have to jump through. That's the job of the client in their book. And so it is up to the artist to be responsible to the budget and to keep track of their own hours. And if you go over, you have the choice to either swallow that within your budget and to end up making $1.380 an hour, or to say, I cannot come down one more time because I cannot afford the airfare, or my budget no longer allows me to do a 5-hour phone call with everyone. I will do a half-hour phone call. So it's up to the artist to draw the line and to keep very attentive to the budget. Your budget is kind of like a spine of your business surviving. You're making an amazing artwork, but if you're doing it at a loss, that's a big problem. Now, one of the things with starting out is, I figure your first 3 projects at least will be losses. You can decide what you want as a loss, but it's sort of like your apprenticeship. And then another 3 projects might be break-even projects. And that's, you still have your day job. And then you step into the making money through this. You have to be pretty savvy to start making money from day one, but you know, that kind of slower start. But by about, 5 projects in, you want to be making money, or else you probably have to change what you're doing or how you're doing it. Because this is my job. I'm not doing this as a labor of love. And I'm doing it because I'm good at this and I want a job. And so I should be paid to be doing the aesthetic chores for the rest of the world. And I deserve a certain amount of money. I don't know why my accountant makes so much money versus me, but that's the way of the world. I mean, people who deal with money always get paid more than people who deal with art. Maybe that will change, but the way I can change that is by being very, very upfront about my costs, and that this looks like it's fun, and it is fun, but it's not that much fun. And I still have to pay my cell phone, and I have to pay for samples to be shipped, and I have to pay for Xeroxes and drawings to be replicated, copied, and that these things all add up, which is why your budget is such a big tool too, because you can sort of say and see these costs all through here. I can't do this for free, no matter how much I love it. But we do have to be careful, because artists can easily be fetishized to say, oh, you must be enjoying yourself, so you don't really have to turn this into a job. But I've been very, I've always wanted my art to be my job and not to go through a gallery situation. So I've worked hard to make it pay for itself.
Stacy, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you are intrigued by our river. And back in my environmental educator days, I used to say to kids, in Akron, your drinking source, your water source is the river. And when you flush your toilet, the water source is that same river. And we are the vessels through which that water passes. And I think there is something to that I wish more Akron residents understood. My question is, when you're working alongside either agencies or more likely the government at times, it can become the office of no. And is it easier for you as an artist to hear the no's up front? What are the things that are non-negotiable? Or do you find in the creative process it's important, which is more helpful, hearing it up front or hearing it through the process? Because there are things, in my case, I work with the federal government, with the National Park Service, there are things that are non-negotiable. And we have found in projects where we're incorporating artists, sometimes it's better just to know that up front, but other times that sometimes stifles creativity. For you, what do you find in that process?
That's a really interesting question.
Sorry, I know it's hard.
There are a lot of no's that we're faced with, and it gets tiresome. And sometimes the no's are reflexive, like reactive, like no, because we don't want to think about even doing that. So sometimes you can get to yes by having a sort of a powerful art agent or project manager who is willing to go the extra 9 yards with the artist, where the naysayer, the person who's constantly like, nope, we can't possibly do that. You have a special meeting and you say, well, how about this alternative? And maybe I go out on a limb and engineer something that is doing something the way I wanted to deal with the site. Sometimes you can convince the person, but you need more than the artist to do it. It has to be the arts administrator has to be on your side too. And you can change minds, because a lot of no's don't have good reasons behind them. They're just like, we just don't want to mess with that. Some no's are like, yes, we have to be accessible because everyone has to be able to walk down here. That's one thing that I can work with. But if someone says no because they just don't want to, I often try and change the mind. So yes, there are hard no's and then there are soft no's. So the hard no's can be coming up first thing. And the soft no's, it's good to know about that. Yeah, but I do feel like it's kind of my job to expand the naysayer's sense of what can be done and what can't be done. Good. Are there any more questions? We don't have much time. Like, I thought when I started out, it's like, my God, I'll never be able to fill 2 hours. Do you want to take a quick look at budgets in the time that we have, and just sort of like how one thinks about them? I'll take
I think that's great, Stacy.
Okay.
I think that would be super valuable.
Okay. I'm going to just, we're going to, oops, there we go in here. We're going to skip a few. This is sort of showing proposals, and like when I'm working with bigger teams, these proposals get quite elaborate. Familiar River, huh? That's in Cleveland. So this is what budget. So when you're doing a proposal, when you've finally gotten your design, you're going to have it approved by various panels. And so you create something about your concept, sort of where the idea is coming from. The I love meanders concept, or dendritic patterns are part of our system. And then it is an actual accurate description of what you want to do. And things like maintenance, everyone wants to know about what kind of maintenance this thing is going to need or require. And just a sort of a hat shake to the idea you understand there will be permitting that you're going to have to jump through to do. But let's get on to there's my abacus, into the budget. So the budget gets all written up as one great big thing, and it's divided up. Everyone divides their budgets differently, and I'll show you how I divide mine. So that's just an overall budget for you to sort of see it all lined up, but we're going to go paragraph by paragraph. So here's the design budget. So design budgets are quite variable, but in this case, I'm trying to figure out how much refinement I'm going to have to do after my initial proposal, which technically I've probably been paid for in another contract, and how many hours that is, and what my hourly rate is. My rates, you can see, are different. When I'm designing, I'm $150 an hour, but when I'm on a phone, I'm $75 an hour, because there's a lot of time on the phone you're not really doing anything except doodling or writing notes. It's not the same kind of concentration. So I feel that having different hourly rates is a really important component. Things like samples, we always forget about how expensive getting samples are. Just shipping heavy samples can add up to a lot. And I've lost money on samples before, so now I make sure to put it in. I do have an artist fee that I just pull out. It's anywhere from 15 to 22% of the budget, depending. If the budget's big, I can take a less of a percentage. If it's a small budget, I need more of it. Like a tip, like that's the way we should tip at restaurants. If you go to a cafe, you should tip 30%. If you're at a really fancy place, you can tip 20%, and the person makes a lot of money. So I take my fee out. It just, I escape it from the budget. I never think about it again because, well, unless I'm going to steal from it later, I want that out of the equation because that's how I make my money. So if I take that out, then I don't pay my cell phone bill. Then I have to think, because I have all this digital drawing that needs to be done, I have to think about those. That's part of the design fee. And then I also think about my prototyping. I didn't used to have prototyping in my budget, but now I see how truly important the prototype is for the success. So money for those materials and for the time it's going to take to fabricate and to test them out. And also because I'm often buying maps, I put that money in. So sometimes there are two levels of design. There's design development, which you're getting to the idea, and then there's final design where you're dotting all your T's or I's and crossing your T's. So, and it's a little bit arbitrary. Sometimes I'm writing things that really one is in the other, and I don't quite know which is which, but the most important thing is the money will flow into my coffers at some point. It's never quite when you expect it to. And one of the things that's hard about art budgets is usually the design is the least expensive part, and it's the part you get paid first. And so you're getting the least amount of your contract early on. So if anything happens to your contract, say it is canceled, you can lose a lot of money because all the expensive components haven't even been billed for yet. Engineering is almost always part of any budget, and you start to work with engineers and get a sense of what they're going to cost. But an engineer in my life has never cost less than $5,000. So, and you're looking for stamped construction documents. Those are the things that I need because they need to be in my file. They're demanded by my contract that they be stamped construction documents, stamped by a certified engineer. And I need them for any liability issues afterwards too. If the thing falls down and they say, Stacy, you did a crap job of doing and putting that together, I say, well, my engineer said it was okay, so let's look at this again. I'm also, the next one is materials. Materials are where things start to get very expensive. The materials that you use outside are robust, and they cost a lot because they're so long lasting, like steel and glass, and even concrete is very expensive. So I'm having to break down the material costs by figuring out how many of the thing I have, how tall they are. So I'm often doing linear footage by amount and getting my totals. So you can see if you go down about 5, the Corten edging, that's a steel edging. And I know what the height I need. I know the linear feet. I know that they need to be bent, and and so I add all of that up. And so materials has its own paragraph. And then fabrication, which I'm often doing, but sometimes not doing. I have to figure out the components of the fabrication, working with someone who is a fabricator and finding out that means I've done the drawings. I haven't done the engineering drawings necessarily, but I've done drawings, and they're giving me an estimate of what the fabrication is going to cost. And I'm putting that in the budget. And trying to remember all the components from, this thing needs to be glued on to this thing needs to be painted. I have to basically go through the entire system from start to finish to figure out, do I have all of the components in the fabrication part? Are they all getting made? Am I accounting for touching everything? Is the money covering it? Installation is often the other expensive. The fabrication is usually the most expensive part. Installation is the second most expensive. So then I have to find out who's going to put this in, who can do that, and do they have a good track record? Are they local? Am I taking them with me? Am I going to oversee them, or are they going to be able to oversee themselves? And I need to know levels of installation, like the foundations, which have to go in months earlier than everything else. Is that person the same as the fabricator or the other installer? I can have 3 or 4 different installers. I may have a concrete person, a steel person, and then in this place, a grading person, and then a planting person. So, 4 or 5 people, 4 or 5 installation people is fairly typical for a job like this. So the important thing is to know that you've covered everything. You haven't left something out. these are kind of like recipes. And if it's like, oh, I was madly cooking along and I forgot I needed 4 cloves of garlic, it's kind of a disaster in certain recipes. It's really a problem if you miss something, and that tends to be what happens. Then there's a whole part of supervision. Sometimes I'm not installing, but I need to oversee the installation because it's very specific to the art piece. So I have to figure that out. That's a little bit easier in terms of price because it's me setting the price. I have to decide what it is for me to be out on site. So I'm saying it's $250 a day. How many days is this really going to take? I try and put in extra so that it's a richer budget. In case I need to draw from it or because it might go over. And so this is where you want it, the supervision part, you want to have it be a little bit over instead of under, because things can go out of line. And then there's always insurance. I need to know what I need to pay for my typical insurance, which I keep going every year, no matter what projects I'm doing. But oftentimes I have other insurance. At the very bottom of this, you see inland marine insurance. If I am shipping expensive things, like the entire piece has been fabricated, painted, and is ready to be shipped across the United States, that's a lot of money tied up in that truck full of art. And if something happens to it, I would be out all that money, yet expected to replace it all and put the piece up. It's like the owner, the client doesn't care what happens to you along the way. They just want to see that piece. I mean, that's a little cold-hearted, but there's a certain legal truth to that. So if something happens to my load of art on the way, I want to be insured. And so sometimes I will have to buy additional insurance for inland marine insurance, or I'll have to buy water pollution insurance in case while we're working in the water, we hit some tank of DDT from 1956. And I will be blamed for dislocating that. So I carry additional insurance sometimes. And you're constantly trying to figure out about travel. There are cheaper places to travel to and more expensive places. Cities are more expensive to stay in, but cheaper to fly to. Odd places there are certain places like Calgary, Canada, that's like so expensive because I have to fly to Denver, to Montana, to Calgary, and back to Toronto. So some places have cheaper flights and some places have cheaper hotels. And so you have to figure out what you're going to need in each place. And that whether you must rent a car or maybe you'll be driving. I have a rule that if it's 6 hours away, it's likely that I will drive it and then I don't have to rent a car. Maybe I know someone, I don't have to stay there, but I usually put in a kind of per diem, which is your hotel and your food, which I always have a very big food bill. And per diem, is basically hotel and food and sort of mileage thrown in there also. So that has to be figured out. And you're figuring out how much and for how many days. So you have to kind of have the whole program of like, okay, I'm going to fly out there and do this. And then I'm going to fly out there again and do the secondary thing. And then the installation will be the third trip. And that's going to be a lot more days. And can I get a cheaper place to stay at that point? Or will I know somebody who can rent me a room instead of me staying at a hotel? So all sorts of figuring goes on into that long-term travel plan, but you don't want to be shorted for that. And then shipping. Shipping has gotten very, very expensive. It used to be a lot cheaper, but it's gone way up. And also the shipping includes all the wrapping and palleting that things need in order to get on the back of a truck. And there also is sometimes your stuff is very, very heavy and it can't be loaded with a typical forklift. You need a crane. And so you have to pay to have a crane, or either have a crane on site or make sure that you're shipping out of somewhere that does have a crane. And then you need a crane in the area where it arrives. Sometimes a construction crew is there and can help get the materials off the truck. And sometimes it isn't. So you have to have a crane to unload the truck too. I've made that mistake once where I thought about the crane in the beginning, but I forgot about the crane in the end. So also there's a problem if you ship your stuff and the site isn't quite ready for you. Where do you store it? Is it safe? Do you have to create a fenced area, which I've had to do? Do you have to hire a security guard to look after it for a week or so while it's sitting there? Because if your components are stolen, your insurance doesn't really truly cover that as well as it should. So off-site storage is something. And then that's about it. So sometimes the crating and shipping has a certain security aspect too. And so it's very important to make sure that you add the taxes in, because certain cities and states will tax you on your what you've spent and what you're being paid. So when I'm buying materials, I'm paying a tax on it, and then my various fees, my whole contract might be taxed too. So you want to figure that in. You have to look it up for each state and figure out where you're working, or a city like the city of Seattle is different than the state of Washington. And so there may be additional taxes you didn't expect. And then the contingency is sort of your slush fund or your rainy day fund. It's if something goes wrong, which something always does go wrong, it gives you a way of not going broke on a project. But it's money that you're holding out. And when you know you have that money there and someone says, well, you can get clear, but if you get blue, it's going to be this much more. It's very easy to say, oh, I'll just use my contingency because I really want the blue. And not always a good idea. That is another thing that you should hold sort of sacrosanct, is to hold on to your contingency until the shit really hits the fan, because sometimes things happen that are just not at all expected, and you need that additional money because the sandblasting is taking 3 times longer than you expected, or because your grading edges aren't meeting and you really have to band it with additional material, or you won't get the ADA to pass you in their overseeing of it. So it's very likely you will need the contingency. So you need to take out, besides taking out your fee, you're also taking out this like rainy day fund out of the budget that you're going to use or allot to other things, and make sure that you have that in case something goes wrong or comes in, like their tariffs on steel and your steel prices go up 30%. And so one way to keep track of that, I think that was sort of asked the question, is like, how do you keep track of this stuff? I have a budget that I might have to show my arts manager, but I have my own private business only budget. And I do a lot of just highlighting with like what I've already spent, what is I'm adding in that I didn't expect, what I'm removing. Sometimes you're taking things out because all of a sudden you realize you can't afford them. And so like in this case, rust means remove this from the budget, and gray is something I'm adding in, and green was from the previous budget and is continuing all the way through with this new budget, because I've had to shift this budget because of the nature of how it's being built. So I keep a lot of track with color. And sometimes I need to know when all of a sudden I've been confronted with a cost that I didn't expect. I need to see if I've sort of done some slush funding on certain things that I can then rob to pay for this additional new cost that I didn't expect. And so you can see in the yellow, I'm talking about when something costs more than expected, and the blue is when something costs less than expected. And so okay, there's my prototypes. It actually didn't come to a full $2,000. So it means I can pull a little money out of that to pay for the layout with the surveyor, who had to come 4 times instead of the anticipated 2 times. And so there's a lot of internal borrowing that goes on that you have to keep track of. And I do find it very hard to keep track of what I spent and what I didn't spend. And when I said, oh, I can find this money in this section of the budget, and I'll move it over to here. You want to keep pretty good notes on your personal budget document that shows what you're doing and the dates of when you did it, because it can be quite confusing. And this is what happens when you wake up at 3 a.m. thinking, I don't have enough money to finish this project. So that's an important thing with budgeting is that you're keeping internal track of the changes that are happening within the budget. You don't have to share those with anybody unless you're hitting a crisis, and then you will share it with your art manager. But it's kind of like your home accounting is all up to you, as long as you're able to pay for what you promised to put out on the site. I'm trying to think what we have. So this is just the quick ending. I'll just run through this, and anyone who has to leave, I totally understand. So I'm inspired by like patterns that I love, and then I'm trying to visualize a system such as the diminishment of the creeks that used to be in Philadelphia, or the silver glint from the air, or how a waterway has been changed by actually engineering it so that it's no longer a passage, but it's it starts to be its own space. And I'm always working at different scales. I'm working at full scale sometimes to see how things are, but I have to also be sending things as photographs and talking about things. So I'm working at small scales too, and doing things where I'm field checking or map checking what the real conditions are. The names of things are very important when I'm doing the stone maps. I'm looking at old maps and overlaying them with modern maps so that I can see where historic waters might be if I'm doing a project like that. This is the Philadelphia airport where I am showing the historic creeks, and that's a very important aspect. And here I am laying out in full scale this huge map. On my studio floor, I've pushed everything to one side. You can see the drawings are just heaped there. I don't know where my dog is. And that's the full scale layout. And then I'm continuing to communicate with my sandblaster, talking about situations that are coming up, and sending him sketches and sending him questions. And then I'm doing the fabrication, going out to my studio in the weekends and the evenings every day, and having assistants come in and help do the cutting and the layout of the letters for this, for these kind of maps. This is one particular kind of fabrication that I do. And here you can see I'm using a different font to show the historic rivers versus the historic creeks versus the existing creeks, so that you can have a sense. Also a different color. Most of the waterways are silver and the historic ones are blue. And one of the things that I really like, and I'll try and run through this quickly, is doing these temporary projects that are part of the long-term ones, where you're investigating a situation with who's ever wanting to do it. It might be in a park, and so neighbors are coming in, or anyone who's interested, or boating groups. They're coming in to work on a project that might be just a day. In this case, we're showing where the water is flowing next to the sports center using these surveyors tools called whiskers. Or we're painting on the pavement to show how the water is flowing underneath this asphalt area, because there used to be a creek here. Or everyone we're working with science educators and school groups and science teachers in elementary school. So everyone is collecting a stream that's near them and bringing it into a depository at the museum, local museum. And we're creating a label that goes out to these school groups as well as jars, so that we can create this matrix of what your water looks like near your house. And this sort of temporary project is really good for getting to know the site and getting to see where the water is flowing. And lots of people get involved. People get involved because they heard about it. Some people get involved because they're walking down the street and they're like, "What are you guys doing?" And I hand someone a bucket of paint, and sometimes they say no, and sometimes they say yes. And I do like temporary projects because they don't linger forever. They're there for a year or so. Sometimes they're there for a day, and sometimes the larger ones are there for a year or so, and they can show a lot of change over time, which a lot of permanent commissions cannot show change, because that's it's too iffy with the materials, and it's not something that people don't want to have something they're not sure where it's going to go. And so this is just installed. This is in Seattle, right under the monorail and the Space Needle. Come on. And it's growing over a summer season here, so it's changing quite a bit. And the installation process, we're using industrial wattles, and we're sewing them together in strange patterns that are based on Baroque garden parterres, and then we're planting them. And then all of the plants are going elsewhere after the project is over. So in a year, all the plants will be picked up and go to these various community gardens, food forests, and Seattle public utility sites. So they're going to have a permanent home. This 1 year is only to, it's kind of like their nursery. So we're rolling them off their site, picking them up with ladders, turned out to be the best way to get them into the trucks. We've rented trucks, and then we're taking each of these to Seattle public utility lands where they need them for erosion control, or community gardens where they just need more plants and they want more diversity and native plants there. And one of the things about thinking about these projects is how little waste I can make, because permanent projects are very material intensive, but the materials sit there. But these temporary projects can have a lot of waste if you don't think about their second life. Everything, all the components need to be adopted after the piece is taken down. And in this case, this was, half-acre site ended up, the only trash we had were these 2 trash bags, which I'm pretty proud of. The fact that everything else got adopted and is growing somewhere. And that was the leftover. It was sort of like, I always say, it's like the mafia bullet holes in the restaurant. It's like, well, remember that? It was like, so there was mud. I actually had to plant grass in the mud pattern. So, and in terms of public art, I will leave you with this, that this is this is like the Ever Given, the huge container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. I love this, of like, what really is the problem with making or doing anything is the workflow that gets jammed in your canal, jammed along the shores of procrastination. And so I hope this all helps. This is sometimes when you're an artist, you do feel very alone in this process, even though it's with a room full of people who are demanding things from you. You're the only one who can sort of give what they need. But so it can be lonesome, even though it's crowded. But I hope that having a little bit of knowledge will help that feeling. So thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much, Stacy. Oh my goodness. This was so insightful, and I think is coming at just the perfect time here in Akron and Summit County as we start exploring different avenues. And we hope to have you here in person very soon to look at sites and to have conversations with other organizations locally. It would just be great to have you part of ours. You know, we're not going to make you move here, but it would be great to have you as part of our Summit County.
We absolutely are
We have a tidal pond, I'll consider.
Yeah.
One more vote in Ohio is a good idea.
That's it. Hey, I'm in Pennsylvania, so I'm pretty important to
You vote twice here. Okay.
early and often. Right.
Yes, perfect. So yes, I'd just like to say a brief thank you to all of our co-hosts for all 3 of these events with Stacy: the Akron Zoo, the City of Akron, the City of Cuyahoga Falls, the Conservancy for the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, Great Lakes Biomimicry, Summit Metro Parks, and the University of Akron Biomimicry and Innovation Center. It's just been tremendous working with all of you, and tremendous hearing from Stacy. And with that, yes, we will say stay in touch. We absolutely will. I don't think any of us will let you go, but but yeah, we greatly appreciated it. And thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for sticking with it.